A widower adopts a bubbly black girl, thinking he's simply giving her a second chance at life. But when he spots the silver necklace she always wears, he's thrown into a whirlwind of emotion. Inside her locket, a photograph of his late wife. How could she possibly have this? The truth about the locket holds a secret so shocking, it will shatter everything he thought he knew. Is this just an extraordinary coincidence? Or is there a deeper connection that could redefine his entire past? And when the truth finally comes out, will it bring them closer or tear them apart? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Robert Sinclair's fingers traced the familiar wooden frame on his desk, his eyes lingering on Patricia's smiling face in the photograph. Even after 3 years, her absence felt like a fresh wound some days. The morning light filtered through the library windows, casting a warm glow on the neat stacks of books surrounding him. "Still keeping everything alphabetized down to the last paperback, I see," a friendly voice called out. Robert looked up to find Alan Green, his best friend of 20 years, leaning against the circulation desk. Alan's presence was as reliable as the sunrise. He'd been checking in on Robert almost daily since Patricia's passing. "Some things never change," Robert replied with a slight smile, straightening a stack of returned books. The familiar routine of organizing and cataloging had become his anchor in a world that felt off balance without Patricia. "Speaking of change," Alan pulled up a chair, his expression turning serious. "There's an adoption fair this weekend at the community center. I think you should come." Robert's hand stilled on the books. "Alan, I don't know if I'm ready for that." "Patricia talked about fostering for years," Alan said gently. "Remember how her eyes would light up whenever she mentioned it?" Robert did remember. The memory of Patricia's enthusiasm was crystal clear. How she'd clip articles about foster care, attend information sessions, and talk about turning their spare room into a child's bedroom. But then the cancer came, and those dreams were filed away with so many others. "The house is too quiet," Alan continued, "and this library could use some young energy. Patricia would want you to at least consider it." Robert glanced at the photograph again. Patricia's eyes seemed to meet his, full of the warmth and hope that had defined her. "I'm 50 years old, Alan. Most people my age are becoming grandparents, not first-time fathers. Age is just a number, my friend. Your heart's still young enough to love." The library fell quiet except for the gentle hum of the heating system. Robert walked over to the window, watching as leaves danced across the parking lot. The spare room at home had remained untouched since Patricia's passing, still painted in the soft yellow she'd chosen years ago. "I wouldn't know where to begin," Robert admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Alan stood and placed a supportive hand on his friend's shoulder. "That's why you start by just showing up. Saturday at 10. No pressure, no commitments. Just come and see." Robert's chest tightened with anxiety, but something else stirred there too. A tiny spark of possibility that he hadn't felt in years. Patricia always said that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest steps. "Smart woman you're, Patricia." Alan smiled warmly. "So I'll pick you up at 9:30? Robert took a deep breath, his gaze returning to the photograph on his desk. Patricia's dream of creating a family hadn't died with her. It had just been waiting, like a seed beneath winter snow, for the right moment to bloom. 9:30, Robert agreed, his voice steadier than he expected. "But I'm not making any promises." "Wouldn't dream of it," Alan replied, heading toward the door. "Just remember, Robert, sometimes the best chapters in our lives are the ones we never planned to write." As the door closed behind his friend, Robert stood in the familiar silence of his library. For the first time in 3 years, that silence felt less like a comfort and more like an invitation to change. The community center buzzed with activity as Robert stepped through the doors. Children's laughter echoed off the walls, mixing with the chatter of prospective parents and social workers. His heart hammered in his chest and he tugged at his collar, already feeling overwhelmed. "You're doing great," Alan whispered before a coordinator whisked him away to fill out some paperwork. Robert stood frozen, watching families interact around him. Some children played games in small groups, while others showed off their talents to interested adults. The scene before him felt both beautiful and terrifying. Patricia would have dove right in, but Robert could barely move his feet. That's when he noticed her. In a quiet corner, away from the main activity, a small black girl sat cross-legged on the floor. Her braids were adorned with colorful beads that clicked softly as she bent over her drawing, completely absorbed in her work. Something about her solitude amid the chaos drew Robert closer. She looked up as his shadow fell across her paper, revealing bright, intelligent eyes that seemed to hold both joy and sadness. A name tag on her purple shirt read, Amara. "Hello," Robert said softly, his librarian's instincts taking over. "May I see what you're drawing?" Amara studied him for a moment, then nodded, carefully lifting her artwork. "It's a house," she explained, her voice clear but shy. "With a red door, like in my dreams." Robert knelt down beside her, noting the detailed flowers she'd drawn along the pathway and the wispy clouds in the crayon blue sky. "You're quite the artist," he said genuinely. "I especially like those yellow daisies." A smile bloomed across Amara's face, lighting up her features. "Those are my favorite. My mom used to grow them." Her expression dimmed slightly at the mention of her mother, and she fiddled with a small pendant hanging from her neck. "Would you mind if I sat with you for a while?" Robert asked, surprising himself with the request. Amara's eyes widened slightly, then she nodded, scooting over to make room. She pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and offered Robert some crayons. "Do you like to draw?" "I'm afraid I'm not very good at it," he admitted, selecting a green crayon. "But I do love stories. I work at the library." "Really?" Amara's whole face lit up. "I love books. The ladies at my foster home read to us sometimes, but I wish I could go to a real library more often." As they talked, Robert found himself relaxing. Amara told him about her favorite books, her dreams of having her own room to decorate with art, and how she sometimes made up stories for the younger kids in her foster home. Her words flowed naturally, but Robert noticed how she carefully avoided certain topics, recognizing the same careful dance he did when people asked about Patricia. Time seemed to slow down in their quiet corner. Robert showed Amara how to fold a paper airplane, something Patricia had taught him years ago. When it soared across their little space, Amara's delighted giggle made his heart feel lighter than it had in years. "Mr. Robert?" Amara asked as they worked on another drawing together. "Do you think someone will pick me today?" The question hit him like a physical blow. In her voice, he heard every lonely night he'd spent staring at Patricia's photo, every silent dinner, every empty moment in their yellow spare room. Before he could respond, a coordinator approached them. "I see you've met Amara," she said warmly. "Would you like to learn more about our adoption process, Mr. Sinclair?" Robert looked at Amara, who was carefully adding a butterfly to their shared artwork, and felt something shift inside him. It wasn't the crushing weight of grief or the paralyzing fear of change. It was something else, something that felt remarkably like hope. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows as Robert led Amara into her new home. Her small backpack and a single cardboard box held all her belongings, but her eyes sparkled with wonder as she took in every detail of the cozy two-story house. "This is really mine?" Amara asked, standing in the doorway of her bedroom. The walls were a soft yellow, and sunlight poured through lace curtains that Patricia had picked out years ago. "All yours," Robert replied, watching as she tentatively stepped inside. "We can paint it any color you'd like." Amara ran her hand along the dresser, then turned in a slow circle. "Could we maybe put some flowers on the walls, like daisies?" "Of course we can." Robert's throat tightened as he remembered Patricia's plans for this room. She had always imagined it filled with a child's laughter. As Amara unpacked her few possessions, Robert noticed how carefully she handled each item. A worn teddy bear, a small collection of books, a folder full of drawings. Each object seemed to hold a special meaning for her. "Would you like to help me make dinner?" Robert asked once she'd finished arranging her things. In the kitchen, Amara perched on a stool at the counter while Robert prepared spaghetti. She insisted on helping to tear the lettuce for the salad, her small fingers working with careful precision. "My mom used to let me help cook too," Amara said softly, her hand automatically reaching for the silver locket that hung around her neck. It was an old-fashioned piece of jewelry, its surface worn smooth with age. "That's a beautiful necklace," Robert commented, noticing how she often touched it when she spoke of her past. Amara's fingers curled protectively around the locket. "It's special," she said, her usual chattiness fading. "I've had it forever." Robert recognized the gentle wall she put up and didn't press further. Instead, he showed her how to set the table, something that seemed to delight her. As they ate dinner together, Robert noticed how different the house felt. For years, he'd eaten alone at the kitchen counter, unwilling to face the empty chairs at the dining room table. Now, Amara's presence filled the space with new energy. She told him about her favorite subjects in school and asked questions about the library where he worked. "Do you have lots of kids' books?" she asked, twirling spaghetti on her fork. "We have an entire children's section," Robert replied, smiling at her enthusiasm. "Maybe you can help me organize it sometime." After dinner, as Robert washed the dishes, he heard humming coming from the living room. Following the sound, he found Amara sitting cross-legged on the floor, drawing. The tune she hummed was unfamiliar but somehow soothing. The simple domestic scene struck him deeply. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel like a museum of memories. Amara's drawings scattered on the coffee table, her shoes by the door, her voice filling the quiet spaces. It all brought a warmth he'd forgotten could exist. When she looked up and smiled at him, Robert felt something in his heart shift and settle. The grief was still there, but alongside it now bloomed something new, hope and the beginning of joy. "Can you tell me a story?" Amara asked, patting the carpet beside her. As Robert sat down, she automatically leaned against his arm, continuing to draw while she waited for him to begin. The trust in that simple gesture nearly overwhelmed him. He cleared his throat and began. "Once upon a time." One evening, after tucking Amara into bed, Robert settled into his favorite armchair with a book. The house had grown peaceful, filled only with the gentle ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. As he reached for his reading glasses on the side table, his hand brushed against something metal. Amara's silver locket lay there, its chain coiled like a tiny snake. Robert picked it up, wondering how it had ended up there. Amara never took it off. Not for baths, not for swimming lessons, not even for bed. His thumb traced the worn surface, feeling the intricate pattern that time had nearly erased. "She must have been playing with it earlier," he murmured to himself, turning it over in his hands. The clasp looked loose. Perhaps that's why she'd removed it. Without really thinking, Robert pressed the small catch on the side. The locket clicked open, and his heart stopped. There, nestled in the tarnished silver, was a photograph he knew as well as his own reflection. Patricia's warm smile beamed up at him, her dark hair falling in waves around her face. It was the same photo he kept on his desk at the library, taken just months before she passed away. Robert's hands began to shake. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. How could Amara have Patricia's picture? The girl had said she'd had the locket forever, but that was impossible. The photograph couldn't be more than 5 years old. "Amara?" he called out, his voice trembling. "Amara? Could you come down here, please?" He heard small feet padding down the stairs, and Amara appeared in her yellow pajamas, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "What's wrong?" Robert held up the open locket. "Sweetheart, I need to ask you something very important. Where did you get this picture?" Amara's eyes widened when she saw her locket in his hands. She rushed forward and grabbed it, clutching it to her chest. "That's mine." "I know it's yours," Robert said gently, though his heart was pounding. "But this picture, this woman in the photo, that's my wife, Patricia. How did you get her picture?" Amara's lower lip trembled. "I didn't. I've always had it. Always. It came with the locket." "But that's not possible," Robert insisted, trying to keep his voice calm despite his growing confusion. "This photo was taken just a few years ago. You said you've had the locket since you were very little." "I did. I did have it. Tears welled up in Amara's eyes. It's mine. The lady at the home said it was with me when they found me. Robert knelt down to her level, his own eyes stinging with tears. Amara, please. This is very important. Are you sure you don't remember where the picture came from? Did someone give it to you? No. Amara clutched the locket tighter, tears now streaming down her face. I don't know how it got there. Please don't be mad. I'm not mad, Robert assured her, pulling her into a hug. I'm just confused. This woman, she was my wife. She passed away before I met you. I don't understand how her picture could be in your locket. Amara buried her face in his shoulder, her small body shaking with sobs. I'm telling the truth. I promise I'm telling the truth. Robert held her close, his mind whirling with questions. How could Patricia's photograph have found its way into Amara's locket? What connection could possibly exist between his late wife and this little girl who had unexpectedly become such an important part of his life? The next morning, after getting Amara off to school, Robert stood at the bottom of the pull-down attic stairs, his heart heavy with uncertainty. He hadn't been up there since Patricia passed away. All her belongings, the things he couldn't bear to look at but couldn't bring himself to give away, sat in carefully labeled boxes, gathering dust in the darkness above. Taking a deep breath, he climbed the creaky steps. The musty air hit him first, followed by the familiar scent of the cedar blocks Patricia had always used to keep moths away. Sunlight filtered through the small round window, casting long shadows across the wooden floorboards. Where do I even start? He whispered to himself, scanning the neat rows of cardboard boxes. Patricia had always been so organized, each box labeled in her flowing handwriting: winter clothes, photo albums, teaching materials. His eyes landed on a box marked personal journals and letters. His hands trembled as he pulled it closer. Inside, he found several leather-bound notebooks, each dated on the spine. He remembered how Patricia would write in them every evening, curled up in her favorite chair by the window. Robert picked up one from 5 years ago, then paused. Opening these felt like crossing a line, like reading someone else's private thoughts. But if there was any chance of understanding the mystery of Amara's locket, he had to look. He opened the journal to a random page in the middle, and his eyes caught a passage from early spring. Met the most extraordinary young woman today at the women's shelter. She couldn't have been more than 20, heavily pregnant and terrified. Said her name was Marie. She had nothing but the clothes on her back and a beautiful silver locket around her neck. The poor dear was shaking like a leaf when I brought her some tea. Robert's breath caught in his throat. He leaned against a dusty trunk, reading more intently. Marie stayed at the shelter for 3 days. I brought her food, clothes, and what comfort I could offer. She told me she had no family, no place to go. The father wasn't in the picture. She was determined to give her baby a better life than she could provide. His hands shook as he turned the page. Today, Marie left the shelter. Before she went, she insisted on giving me her locket, the only valuable thing she owned. I tried to refuse, but she said it was important to her that I have it. For everything you've done, she said. Maybe someday it can help another scared girl like me. I'll never forget the look in her eyes. Robert had to stop reading for a moment. His vision had become blurry with tears. Could it be possible? Was Amara the baby Marie had been carrying? He flipped through more pages, finding scattered mentions of Marie. Patricia had tried to keep track of her but lost contact after a few months. The last entry about her simply read, "Still no word from Marie. I pray she and her baby are safe. I keep the locket close, hoping that somehow, someday, it might find its way to where it needs to be." Robert closed the journal, his mind spinning. Patricia had kept the locket, but how had it ended up with Amara? And why was Patricia's photo inside it now, instead of whatever had been there originally? The questions multiplied in his head as he sat there among the boxes of memories, holding the journal that contained pieces of a puzzle he was only beginning to understand. Through the attic window, he could see the school bus dropping off children, including Amara, her bright yellow backpack bouncing as she walked toward the house. Over the next few days, Robert's mind churned with questions about the locket. During breakfast, He'd catch himself staring at Amara over his coffee cup, searching her face for answers that weren't there. Their usual morning chats grew shorter, replaced by long stretches of silence. Amara noticed the change. She'd peek up at him while spreading jam on her toast, her small shoulders tense. Sometimes she'd try to start a conversation, but Robert's responses came out distracted and short. "Is everything okay?" she'd ask, her voice tiny and uncertain. "Everything's fine," he'd reply, but his smile never quite reached his eyes. At school, Amara found comfort in art class, her favorite subject. One Tuesday morning, while working on their fall-themed paintings, she noticed Lily Jenkins sitting alone at the corner table. Lily was new and hadn't made any friends yet. Her long brown hair hung like a curtain around her face as she hunched over her work. Two girls from their class walked past Lily's table, giggling and pointing at her painting. "That doesn't even look like a tree," one whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear. Lily's cheeks turned bright red, and she tried to cover her artwork with her arms. Amara remembered how it felt to be alone and scared. Without hesitation, she gathered her art supplies and moved to Lily's table. "Can I sit here?" she asked softly. Lily looked up, surprised, and nodded. "I like your tree," Amara said, settling into her chair. "The way you made the leaves all swirly makes it look like it's dancing in the wind." A small smile crept across Lily's face. "Really? The other girls said it was weird." "Sometimes weird is good," Amara replied, pulling out her favorite purple crayon. "Want to see how I make my trees dance too?" From that day on, Amara and Lily became inseparable during art class. When the same girls tried to make fun of their paintings again, Amara stood up straight and said, "We like our trees exactly how they are." Her voice was quiet but firm, and the bullies, surprised by her confidence, walked away. At home that evening, Robert watched from the kitchen window as Amara played in the backyard. She was drawing with chalk on the concrete patio, creating a colorful garden of flowers and trees. Her face showed the same gentle determination he'd seen in Patricia whenever she helped others at the women's shelter. The guilt hit him hard then. Here he was, letting his doubts build walls between them, while Amara kept showing nothing but kindness and love. She'd done nothing wrong. The mystery of the locket wasn't her fault. He thought about calling her inside, about trying to bridge the gap that had grown between them. But the words stuck in his throat. What would he say? How could he explain his distance without hurting her more than he already had? Instead, he watched as she drew, her small hand gripping the chalk with care, adding details to each flower petal. The setting sun painted her face in warm golden light, and for a moment, she looked so much like the little girl Patricia had always dreamed of having in their lives. Robert pressed his hand against the cool window glass, his heart aching with a mixture of love and uncertainty. He wanted to trust in this connection they'd built, to believe that somehow, through Patricia's kindness years ago, they were meant to find each other. But the questions about the locket still nagged at him, keeping him from fully opening his heart. The next morning, after dropping Amara off at school, Robert sat in his car in the parking lot of the Evergreen Adoption Agency. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he gathered his courage. The brick building looked exactly the same as it had weeks ago when he'd first met Amara, but today it held different promises, answers to questions that kept him awake at night. Inside, the receptionist recognized him and smiled warmly. "Mr. Sinclair, how's everything going with Amara?" "That's actually why I'm here," Robert said, his voice slightly unsteady. "I need to speak with someone about Amara's background. There are some things I need to understand." 20 minutes later, Robert sat across from Mrs. Chen, the social worker who had handled Amara's case. Her desk was neat and organized, much like his own at the library. She pulled out a thick manila folder and opened it carefully. "What specifically would you like to know about Amara's history, Mr. Sinclair?" Robert cleared his throat. "Everything you can tell me, especially about her mother." Mrs. Chen's expression softened. Amara's mother, Diane Thompson, passed away when Amara was 4. It was a car accident, very tragic. Amara was at daycare when it happened. She paused, flipping through some papers. Diane was a single mother, worked 2 jobs to make ends meet. No other family came forward to take Amara. Robert's heart ached thinking of little Amara, suddenly alone in the world. Was anything found with her mother? Any personal effects? Mrs. Chen raised an eyebrow but continued looking through the file. Yes, actually. There's a note here about her personal belongings. She pulled out a document and adjusted her reading glasses. Among her possessions was a silver bracelet. Quite distinctive. It was part of a matching set with a necklace. Robert's breath caught in his throat. The necklace Amara wears? Yes, Mrs. Chen nodded. Diane was wearing the bracelet when they found her. The report mentions intricate butterfly designs on both pieces. Amara was already wearing the necklace, and of course, we let her keep it. It seemed very important to her, even at that young age. Robert's mind raced. Patricia had written about giving a necklace back to the pregnant woman she'd helped, but she'd never mentioned a bracelet. Could there be more to the story? Where did this happen, he asked. The accident? In Millbrook, Mrs. Chen replied, referring back to the file. About 30 minutes from here. Diane had just moved there a few months before the accident. Before that, she squinted at the papers. Before that, there's not much information. She seems to have moved around quite a bit. Robert remembered Patricia's volunteer work at the women's shelter in Millbrook. She'd spent years helping women get back on their feet, finding them jobs and safe places to live. The timing would have been right, around the time Patricia wrote about helping the pregnant woman in her journal. Is there any way to access more records about Diane? About her life before Millbrook? Mrs. Chen shook her head. Most of that information is sealed or simply wasn't documented. Many of the women who came through the shelter system during those years were trying to start fresh, to leave difficult situations behind. Robert sat back in his chair, his mind swimming with new information. The bracelet and necklace set, Millbrook, the women's shelter, pieces of a puzzle that still wouldn't quite fit together. He could feel that he was close to understanding something important, but the full picture remained just out of reach. Thank you, he said quietly, standing up. You've been very helpful. As he walked back to his car, Robert felt the weight of these new revelations pressing down on him. The connection between Patricia and Amara's mother seemed stronger than ever, but the exact nature of their relationship remained a mystery. Back at home that evening, Robert sat at his desk, Amara's locket open in his trembling hands. He'd looked at Patricia's photo inside it dozens of times now, but something made him examine it more closely tonight. Holding it under his desk lamp, he squinted at the background behind Patricia's smiling face. There, barely visible in the fuzzy background, was a sign on a wall. Robert grabbed his reading glasses and leaned in closer. The words were faint, but he could just make them out. Millbrook General Hospital, labor and delivery. His heart began to race. The date stamp in the corner of the photograph showed March 15th, exactly 8 years ago. Robert remembered that day. Patricia had been volunteering at the hospital, something she did every Wednesday afternoon. The memory washed over him like a warm wave. Patricia burst through their front door that evening, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Robert, you won't believe the day I had." He looked up from his newspaper, smiling at his wife's enthusiasm. Patricia's eyes were bright, her hospital volunteer badge still pinned to her sweater. "There was this young woman in the waiting room today," Patricia continued, settling onto the couch beside him. She was all alone, terrified about her pregnancy. No family, no support system. Patricia's voice softened. "She reminded me so much of myself when we first found out we couldn't." Robert reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. Their own struggles with infertility had led Patricia to volunteer at the hospital, turning her pain into purpose. "I sat with her for hours," Patricia went on. "She was so scared, Robert, but so brave too. She gave me this beautiful necklace as a thank you. Said it was a family heirloom." Patricia touched her neck, then shook her head. "I couldn't keep it, of course. I gave it back to her before she left. But she insisted on taking our picture together." Robert blinked back to the present, his office coming into focus around him. That photograph, could it be the same one he now held in his hands? The timing would make sense. Amara was 7 years old, and this photo was taken 8 years ago. He pulled out his phone and searched for Millbrook General Hospital's number. After 3 transfers, he finally reached the records department. "I'm looking for information about a patient from 8 years ago," he explained. "March 15th, in the labor and delivery ward." "I'm sorry, sir," the clerk replied. "We can't release patient information without proper authorization." "Please," Robert's voice cracked slightly. "My wife volunteered there, Patricia Sinclair. She passed away 2 years ago. I'm trying to understand a connection that might be very important to a little girl who needs answers." There was a long pause on the line. "Mr. Sinclair, I remember Patricia," the clerk said softly. "She was here every Wednesday for years. I can't give you patient details, but I can tell you we keep volunteer records. If you'd like to come in, you could look through those." Robert felt a surge of hope. "When would be a good time?" "We open at 8 a.m. tomorrow. Ask for Nancy at the front desk. I'll leave a note about your visit." After hanging up, Robert stared at the locket again. Patricia's kind smile beamed up at him, and he could almost hear her voice. "Everything happens for a reason, Robert. We just have to be patient enough to understand why." He carefully closed the locket, his mind already planning tomorrow's visit to the hospital. Somewhere in those volunteer records, he might find the missing piece that connected Patricia, Amara's mother, and the silver locket that had brought them all together. The autumn breeze rustled through the trees at Madison Park as Robert watched Amara on the swings. The past few days had been tense, with both of them tiptoeing around each other since the discovery of Patricia's photo. Today, he decided, would be different. They needed this time together. "Higher, Robert, push me higher!" Amara called out, her braids flying in the wind. Her laughter, pure and bright, echoed across the playground. Robert smiled and gave her another gentle push. "Hold on tight, sweetheart." As her swinging slowed, Amara dragged her feet in the wood chips to stop. "Can we sit on the bench? I'm getting dizzy." They settled on a nearby bench, and Robert pulled out 2 juice boxes from his backpack. Amara took hers with a quiet, "Thank you," puncturing the top with the straw. "Robert," she asked, her voice small, "did you ever move around a lot when you were little?" He shook his head. "No, I grew up in the same house until I went to college. Why do you ask?" Amara fiddled with her straw wrapper. "I moved 6 times before I came to live with you. Different houses, different families." She paused, her eyes fixed on a mother and daughter playing by the sandbox. The little girl had fallen and her mother was kissing her scraped knee. "Sometimes I'd just start to feel at home, and then I'd have to leave again." Robert's heart ached. He wanted to reach out to hug her, but something held him back. His own uncertainty, the weight of Patricia's photograph in that locket. "The worst part was packing," Amara continued, still watching the mother and daughter. "I got really good at fitting everything in one suitcase. Except this one time I almost lost my necklace." Her hand automatically went to the silver locket. "I was so scared. It's the only thing I have that's really mine, you know. From before." "Before?" Robert prompted gently. "Before the foster homes. I don't remember much about my mom anymore. Just little things like how she smelled like vanilla and how she used to hum when she brushed my hair." Amara's voice wavered. "Sometimes I'm scared I'll forget everything about her. But when I wear this necklace, it feels like she's still here somehow." Robert felt tears prick at his eyes. Here he'd been, so caught up in the mystery of Patricia's photograph that he'd forgotten what the locket meant to Amara, a link to her mother, a piece of her history. "The ladies at the foster care office told me my mom loved me very much," Amara said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "They said sometimes parents have to leave even when they don't want to. Do you think that's true?" Robert swallowed hard. "Yes, sweetheart. Sometimes people leave us even when they love us more than anything in the world." He thought of Patricia, of her endless compassion, of how she would have loved this little girl sitting beside him. Finally, he did what he should have done days ago. He put his arm around Amara's shoulders and pulled her close. She leaned into him, her small body shaking with quiet sobs. "I miss her," Amara whispered. "Even though I can't remember her face anymore, I still miss her." "I know," Robert said softly, running his hand over her braids. I know you do. He held her tighter, realizing that whatever mystery surrounded the locket, whatever connection existed between Patricia and Amara's mother, what mattered most was the little girl in his arms who needed him right now. The sterile hospital corridors hadn't changed much in the past decade. Robert walked through the familiar halls of St. Mary's Hospital, where Patricia had volunteered for years. His footsteps echoed against the linoleum floors as he made his way to the nurse's station. I'm looking for Nancy Wheeler, he said to the young receptionist. I was told she still visits sometimes, even though she's retired. Oh, you're in luck. She's actually here today helping with our volunteer program. The receptionist pointed down the hall. Check the third-floor lounge. Robert found Nancy exactly where the receptionist said she'd be. She was a petite woman in her 70s with silver hair and kind eyes that crinkled when she smiled. She sat at a small table, sorting through donation papers. Mrs. Wheeler? Robert approached carefully. I'm Robert Sinclair. My wife Patricia used to volunteer here. Nancy's face lit up with recognition. Patricia. Oh, what a wonderful soul she was. Please, sit down. She gestured to the chair across from her. How is she? Robert's expression softened. She passed away 5 years ago. Oh, I'm so sorry. Nancy reached across the table and patted his hand. She was one of our most dedicated volunteers. The patients loved her. Actually, that's why I'm here. Robert pulled out the photograph from the locket. Do you remember this day? It would have been about 8 years ago. Nancy adjusted her reading glasses and studied the image. Yes, I do. This was taken during our prenatal care program. Patricia spent a lot of time with one particular young woman. Sweet girl, but so scared and alone. Robert leaned forward. Can you tell me more about her? Let me think. Nancy tapped her chin. She was barely 20, if I remember correctly, coming to appointments all by herself. Patricia noticed her crying in the waiting room one day and just took her under her wing. A memory flashed in Robert's mind. Patricia coming home late from volunteering, talking about a young mother-to-be who needed support. He hadn't paid much attention then, but now every detail mattered. The poor thing was estranged from her family, Nancy continued. Said they didn't approve of her choices. She was terrified of raising a baby alone. She shook her head sadly. Patricia went above and beyond, attended every appointment with her, helped her prepare for the baby's arrival. Robert's heart raced. Do you remember her name? Nancy stood up and walked to a filing cabinet in the corner. We keep some of the old volunteer records. Patricia used to log her hours and activities. She pulled out a worn binder and began flipping through pages. Here it is. Summer of 2015. She mentioned working with Maya Thompson. Robert's hands trembled as he processed the information. Maya Thompson, Amara's mother's name. The same name he'd seen in the adoption records. Patricia was devastated when Maya stopped coming to appointments suddenly, Nancy said, closing the binder. She tried to find her, but Maya had changed her phone number and moved away. Patricia worried about her for months. Did Maya ever mention why she left? She was scared about something, or someone. Patricia said Maya had mentioned feeling watched, but she never gave details. Nancy sighed. The last time anyone saw her here, she gave Patricia that necklace. Said it was a thank you for being the only person who cared. Robert sat back, overwhelmed by the connections falling into place. Patricia had known Amara's mother, had tried to help her, and somehow, years later, Patricia's final wish to foster a child had led him to Maya's daughter. You know, Nancy added softly, Patricia always said that sometimes the universe works in mysterious ways to bring the right people together. Robert's hands shook as he spread the documents across his kitchen table. The hospital records, Patricia's journal, and the newspaper clipping about the accident that took his wife's life. His eyes darted between the dates, his breath catching in his throat. December 15th, 2018. The date was burned into his memory, the day Patricia died. And now, staring at Amara's records, he saw it again. the same date listed as the day Maya Thompson, Amara's mother, had passed away. The room seemed to spin as memories flooded back. That rainy evening, the screech of tires, the crushing metal. Details he'd tried so hard to forget now demanded his attention. "No," he whispered, his voice breaking. "It can't be." But it was. The pieces clicked together with devastating clarity. He remembered the other car, a small blue sedan that had swerved to avoid a fallen tree branch. Patricia, always thinking of others even in crisis, had tried to help. The memory hit him like a physical blow. Patricia, bleeding but conscious, had crawled out of their damaged car. "Stay here, Robert," she'd insisted. "I need to check on them." Despite his protests, she'd stumbled toward the other vehicle, where a young woman was trapped. Through the rain and chaos, he'd watched Patricia reach through the broken window, speaking softly to the panicked driver. And then, a detail that had seemed insignificant until now, she'd removed her necklace and passed it through the window. "Here," Patricia had said, her voice carrying on the wind. "Hold on to this. Help is coming. Stay with me." Robert's legs gave out, and he sank into a kitchen chair. The necklace. Patricia's last act of kindness had been to comfort Maya Thompson, Amara's mother, in her final moments. Sirens had filled the air. Emergency workers had swarmed both vehicles. But by the time they'd reached the hospital, Patricia was gone. He'd never thought to ask about the other driver, too consumed by his own grief. "Uncle Robert?" Amara's small voice startled him. She stood in the doorway, clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit. "Can we read a story?" Robert stared at her, seeing for the first time how the universe had woven their lives together through tragedy. The daughter of the woman Patricia tried to save. The necklace that had found its way back to him. It was too much. Not right now, Amara," he managed, his voice rough. "I need to work on something." Disappointment clouded her face. "Oh, okay." She lingered for a moment, then turned away, her shoulders slumping. Over the next few days, Robert found himself pulling away from Amara. Every time he looked at her, he saw the accident, heard the sirens, felt the crushing weight of that night. He began working later at the library, making excuses to skip their evening routines. Amara noticed the change. Her usual cheerful chatter grew quiet. She spent more time in her room, drawing pictures he couldn't bring himself to look at. The distance between them grew, filled with unspoken truths and painful memories. One evening, he overheard her talking to her stuffed rabbit. "Maybe he doesn't want me anymore," she whispered. "Just like all the other homes." The words pierced his heart, but he couldn't bridge the gap. Not yet. Not while he was drowning in the revelation that his beloved Patricia's final moments were spent trying to save Amara's mother. The weight of their intertwined tragedy felt impossible to bear. The morning sun filtered through the classroom windows as Amara sat at her desk, barely touching her lunch. Her usually bright eyes were distant, fixed on the untouched sandwich in front of her. Lily, noticing her friend's silence, scooted her chair closer. "Are you okay, Amara? You seem sad today." Amara's lower lip trembled. "Uncle Robert doesn't want me anymore," she whispered, fiddling with her necklace. "He stays late at work and doesn't read me stories like he used to." "That can't be true," Lily said softly, placing her small hand on Amara's arm. "Remember how you helped me when Tommy was being mean to me? You told me sometimes people act different when they're hurting inside." Tears welled up in Amara's eyes. "But what if he sends me away like my other foster homes did?" Across town at the library, Robert sat in his office staring at Patricia's photograph. The door creaked open, and Alan Green stepped in, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You look terrible, Rob," Alan said, setting a cup on the desk. "What's eating at you?" Robert ran his hands over his face. "I found out something, Alan. Something about Patricia and Amara." His voice cracked as he pulled out the newspaper clipping. "The accident that killed Patricia? Amara's mother was in the other car." Alan's eyes widened as Robert explained everything. The necklace, Patricia's final moments, the devastating connection that bound them all together. "I can't handle it," Robert admitted, his shoulders sagging. Every time I look at Amara, I see that night. I see Patricia trying to save her mother. How can I be a father to her with all this between us? Alan listened quietly, then leaned forward. So you're pulling away from a little girl who's already lost everything? That doesn't sound like the Robert I know. And it sure doesn't sound like something Patricia would do. Later that afternoon, Robert arrived early to pick up Amara from school. Through the playground fence, he watched her sitting with Lily under a large oak tree. A group of younger children played nearby, and one small boy tripped, scraping his knee. Without hesitation, Amara rushed over. She helped the boy up, brushed off his pants, and offered him her favorite rainbow sticker from her notebook. "It's okay," she said, her voice carrying across the playground. "Sometimes we fall down, but that means we can get back up again." Robert's breath caught in his throat. The gentle way she tended to the crying child, the soft words of comfort. It was pure Patricia, the same instinct to help, to heal, to make things better. The boy's tears turned to smiles as Amara and Lily invited him to play with them. They formed a small circle, teaching him a clapping game until his mother arrived. Robert watched, remembering Alan's words. The weight of the past week pressed against his chest, but for the first time, he saw beyond the tragedy that connected them. He saw Amara, not as a reminder of loss, but as a living embodiment of Patricia's spirit of kindness. As he stood there, Amara looked up and noticed him. For a moment, uncertainty flickered across her face. Then Lily whispered something in her ear, and Amara managed a small, hopeful wave in his direction. And that Robert raised his hand to wave back, feeling something shift inside his heart. The pain was still there, but alongside it, something else began to take root. A glimmer of understanding about why Patricia's final act had been to comfort Amara's mother, and why their paths had crossed again after all these years. The autumn wind rustled through the trees as Robert's car pulled up to the side of Old Mill Road. His hands trembled slightly as he turned off the engine. For 5 years, he had avoided this stretch of highway, taking longer routes just to bypass the memories it held. Now, stepping out onto the gravel shoulder, Robert felt the weight of that day pressing down on him. The guardrail had been replaced, the scorched pavement resurfaced, but he could still see it all in his mind. The twisted metal, the shattered glass, the final goodbye he never got to say. A pickup truck slowed as it passed, then pulled over ahead of him. An older man with silver hair and weathered features stepped out, watching Robert with careful eyes. "You must be Mr. Sinclair," the man called out, walking toward him. "I'm Ethan Harper. I was one of the first responders that night." Robert's throat tightened. "How did you know who I am?" Ethan's expression softened. "I recognized you from the papers back then. Plus, not many folks stop here these days." He gestured to a small wooden cross planted near the guardrail. "I maintain that memorial. Your wife, she was something special." You were here?" Robert's voice cracked. "That night?" Ethan nodded slowly, his eyes distant with memory. "I was. 28 years as a paramedic, but that night stays with me. Your wife, Patricia, she was conscious when we arrived, but instead of letting us help her, she kept pointing to the other car, begging us to check on the pregnant woman inside." Robert's legs felt weak. He leaned against his car, drinking in every detail. "The other vehicle was on fire," Ethan continued. "Patricia had somehow managed to crawl over to it. We found her holding the woman's hand through the window, trying to keep her calm. She'd given her that necklace, said it would protect her baby." Tears blurred Robert's vision. Did Patricia know the woman wouldn't make it?" "I think she did," Ethan said quietly. "The woman was trapped. The fire was spreading fast. But Patricia wouldn't leave her side. Kept talking to her, promising her child would be safe." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "In all my years of service, I never saw such courage." Robert slid down to sit on the ground, overwhelmed by the image of Patricia in her final moments, still thinking of others, still trying to help. "We tried to pull Patricia away," Ethan continued, sitting beside him, "but she refused to leave until we promised to look after the baby. The flames were getting worse. We couldn't save either of them in time." The wind picked up, carrying dead leaves across the road. Robert stared at them, remembering how Patricia had always loved autumn. "Your wife's last words," Ethan said softly, were, "Tell Robert to keep his heart open. I should have found you sooner to share that. But sometimes the right moments find us when we need them most." Robert wiped his eyes, thinking of Amara, her gentle spirit, her kindness to others, the way she seemed to carry Patricia's light within her. Even in death, Patricia had found a way to bring love back into his life. "Thank you," Robert managed to say, "for being here that night, for telling me this now." Ethan placed a steady hand on Robert's shoulder. Patricia's sacrifice wasn't just about saving a life that night. Somehow she knew that child would find her way to you. That's the kind of love that echoes through time. The evening shadows stretched across Robert's living room as he sat in his favorite armchair, Patricia's journal open in his lap. The house felt unusually quiet. Upstairs, he could hear the soft padding of Amara's footsteps as she moved around her room, but the usual sound of her humming or chattering to herself was missing. Robert stared at Patricia's neat handwriting, his fingers tracing the words on the page. There's something magical about children, the way they see the world with such wonder and hope. I dream of fostering a child, of sharing our love and creating a family that goes beyond blood. The words blurred as tears filled his eyes. How could he tell Amara that her mother and Patricia had died together? That Patricia's final moments were spent trying to save her mother? The weight of it all pressed down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. A small creak made him look up. Amara stood in the doorway, clutching her sketchbook. Her usually bright eyes were clouded with uncertainty. "Can I show you my drawing from art class?" she asked softly. Robert forced a smile. "Of course," he said, but his voice sounded distant even to his own ears. Amara approached slowly, as if afraid he might send her away. She held out her sketchbook, revealing a crayon drawing of 3 figures: a tall man with glasses that was clearly Robert, a little girl with curly hair, and a woman with a gentle smile wearing a necklace. "That's you and me and—" Amara's voice trailed off as she pointed to the woman. "I drew my mom. Mrs. Dawson said we should draw our families." Robert's throat tightened. He couldn't speak. "Did I do something wrong?" Amara asked, her lower lip trembling. "You don't talk to me anymore. You look sad when you see me." Before Robert could respond, the phone rang. He answered it mechanically, grateful for the interruption. It was Mrs. Dawson, Amara's teacher. "Mr. Sinclair, I've noticed some changes in Amara's behavior lately," Mrs. Dawson said. "She's usually such a bright, engaging student, but she's become withdrawn. I think it would be helpful if we could schedule a parent-teacher meeting to discuss her adjustment." Robert watched as Amara quietly gathered her sketchbook and slipped out of the room. "Yes," he said, his chest aching. "Yes, of course." After hanging up, Robert returned to Patricia's journal. He flipped through the pages until he found an entry from shortly before her death. "Love isn't just about the family we're born into. It's about the family we choose to create. Sometimes the greatest gifts come to us in unexpected ways, through paths we never imagined taking." Robert closed his eyes, remembering Ethan's words about Patricia's final moments, how she had refused to leave Amara's mother, how she had made them promise to look after the baby. Even then, Patricia had been thinking about creating family, about protecting a child who needed love. He looked at the empty doorway where Amara had stood moments ago, realizing how his guilt and confusion were pushing away the very gift Patricia had helped preserve. He was letting his pain overshadow the miracle that had brought Amara into his life, a miracle that Patricia had helped create with her final act of love. The parent-teacher meeting notice sat on his desk, a reminder that while he wrestled with his emotions, a little girl was struggling to understand why the person who had promised to be her family was slipping away. Robert sat in the small plastic chair across from Mrs. Dawson's desk, feeling oddly out of place in the cheerful classroom decorated with children's artwork. The afternoon sun filtered through construction paper cutouts on the windows, casting colorful shadows across the floor. Mrs. Dawson pulled out a folder filled with Amara's work. "Mr. Sinclair, I wanted to share some things about Amara that might help you understand her better. She spread several drawings across her desk. Amara has an extraordinary gift for expressing herself through art. Robert leaned forward, studying the vibrant pictures. Each one showed remarkable detail for a 7-year-old. There were drawings of children playing together, of flowers blooming in gardens, and of Lily, the shy girl from Amara's class, smiling and holding hands with Amara. Just last week, Mrs. Dawson continued, we had an incident where some children were excluding Lily during recess. Amara noticed and immediately went to sit with her. She shared her crayons and taught Lily how to draw butterflies. She smiled warmly. That's the kind of child Amara is, naturally compassionate, always looking out for others. Robert's chest tightened with a mixture of pride and guilt. While he'd been wrapped up in his own emotional turmoil, Amara had been showing the same kindness that Patricia had always valued. Mrs. Dawson pulled out another drawing. There's something else I've noticed. Amara frequently draws this same house. She handed Robert a picture of a 2-story house with a distinctive red door. When I asked her about it, she said it was from a dream she had about her mother. Robert's hands trembled slightly as he held the drawing. The red door triggered a memory. Patricia sitting at their kitchen table years ago, excitedly describing her latest volunteer project. She had helped establish a safe house for young mothers in crisis, and she'd insisted on painting the front door bright red. It's a beacon of hope, Patricia had said. When these women see that red door, they'll know they've found a safe place. Does Amara draw this house often? Robert asked, his voice slightly hoarse. Mrs. Dawson nodded, pulling out several more drawings. At least once a week. Sometimes she adds different details, but the red door is always the same. She paused, studying Robert's face. Is something wrong, Mr. Sinclair? Robert shook his head, still staring at the drawings. No, not wrong. Just unexpected. He carefully set the pictures down. How is Amara doing otherwise? I know I haven't been as present lately. Mrs. Dawson's expression softened. She's struggling with that. Amara is incredibly resilient, but she's also sensitive. She notices when people pull away. She gestured to another drawing, this one showing a small figure standing alone in the rain. Her art tells us what she can't always say with words. Robert felt the weight of his recent behavior settling heavily on his shoulders, but amid the guilt, a new sense of purpose was emerging. The red door in Amara's drawings couldn't be a coincidence. If her mother had stayed at Patricia's safe house, it might explain how their paths had crossed. Thank you, Mrs. Dawson, Robert said, standing up. You've helped more than you know. He gathered the drawings, each one feeling like a piece of a puzzle he was finally beginning to understand. As he walked to his car, Robert knew his next step. He needed to visit that safe house with the red door. Perhaps there, in the place where Patricia had offered hope to so many women, he would find the answers that would help him embrace the gift she had left behind. Not just Amara's presence in his life, but the chance to create the family Patricia had always dreamed of. The red door hadn't changed. Robert stood before it, his heart pounding as memories of Patricia's enthusiasm about this place flooded back. The paint was slightly faded now, but it still served as the beacon of hope she had intended it to be. Taking a deep breath, he pressed the doorbell. After a moment, a woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair opened the door. Her warm smile reminded him of Patricia. I'm Robert Sinclair, he said, his voice catching slightly. Patricia Sinclair's husband. Recognition flickered across the woman's face. Oh my goodness, Patricia's Robert. I'm Diane Walker. Please, come in. She ushered him into a cozy office filled with photographs of smiling women and children. I've thought about reaching out to you so many times over the years. Patricia was such a light in this place. Robert settled into a chair, taking in the comfortable disorder of the space, filing cabinets covered with children's artwork, potted plants on every windowsill. I'm here because, well, it's complicated. But I need to know about a young woman Patricia might have helped years ago. Diane's eyes softened with understanding. Patricia helped so many women, but I remember one in particular. She moved to a filing cabinet, pulling out a worn folder. She came to us on a rainy night, Terrified and alone, Patricia took her under her wing immediately. Robert leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. What was she like? Young, scared, but determined. Diane leafed through the folder. Patricia saw something special in her, spent extra time with her, brought her prenatal vitamins, even taught her to knit baby booties. She paused, her expression growing sad. But one day she just disappeared, left a note saying she couldn't bear to be a burden anymore. Did Patricia try to find her? Diane nodded, pulling out a faded photograph. Patricia was heartbroken. She kept trying to contact her through mutual friends, wanted to make sure she and the baby were okay. She handed Robert the photo, and his breath caught in his throat. There was Patricia, younger and radiant, her arm around a pregnant young woman. The woman's face was turned slightly away from the camera, but Robert could see the familiar features that he now recognized in Amara. Around the young woman's neck hung the silver locket that now belonged to her daughter. She wore a matching bracelet, Diane added softly. Patricia gave them to her as a set, said every mother and child should have something to connect them. Robert's hands trembled as he held the photograph. Did Patricia ever find her again? No, Diane sighed. But she never stopped hoping. Even years later, she would ask if we'd heard anything. She studied Robert's face carefully. Why are you asking about this now, Robert? Robert carefully placed the photograph on Diane's desk. Because I think I'm raising her daughter. His voice cracked as he explained about Amara, the locket, and the tragic accident that had claimed both Patricia and Amara's mother. Diane's eyes filled with tears as she listened. Oh, Robert, she whispered. Patricia would be so happy to know you found each other. That little girl she worried about all those years ago, her daughter is with you now. It's like Patricia's still taking care of them both through you. Robert felt a weight lifting from his chest as the final pieces fell into place. Patricia's compassion had created this connection years ago, and now he understood that taking care of Amara wasn't just about honoring Patricia's memory. It was about continuing the love she had started giving long before he even knew Amara existed. The evening sun cast long shadows through the living room windows as Robert and Amara sat together on the couch. The silver locket rested between them on a small velvet cloth, its surface catching the golden light. Robert had spent the drive home from the safe house rehearsing what to say, but now that the moment had arrived, the words felt heavy in his mouth. Amara, he began softly, I want to tell you something about my wife, Patricia. Amara looked up from her homework, her dark eyes curious. The lady in the pictures? Robert nodded, picking up the locket carefully. Yes. You see, before she passed away, Patricia spent a lot of time helping people who needed someone to care for them. He paused, studying Amara's face. There was one person in particular who reminds me very much of your mother. Amara set her pencil down, her full attention now on Robert. Really? What was she like? She was young and brave, Robert said, his voice gentle. Patricia saw how special she was, just like... He swallowed hard. Just like I see how special you are. Amara's fingers traced the pattern on her notebook, her voice quiet. Sometimes I try really hard to remember my mom, but it's like trying to remember a dream. She looked at the locket. But when I wear this, it feels like she's not so far away. Robert felt his heart constrict. The locket means a lot to you, doesn't it? Amara nodded, reaching for it. Can I wear it to school every day? Her voice carried a hint of worry, as if afraid he might say no. It makes me feel better when I'm scared or lonely, like I'm connected to something bigger, even if I don't know exactly what it is. Robert watched as she carefully opened the locket, looking at Patricia's photograph inside. The simple gesture, filled with such reverence, touched something deep within him. Here was this child, unknowingly carrying a piece of both her mother and Patricia with her, finding comfort in their combined legacy. Of course you can wear it, he said, his voice thick with emotion. It belongs with you. Amara's face lit up. Really? You're not worried I'll lose it? Robert shook his head, helping her fasten the chain around her neck. No, sweetheart. I trust you with it completely. The words felt significant, extending beyond just the locket. Thank you, Amara whispered, touching the silver pendant now resting against her chest. She leaned against Robert's arm, a gesture that had become more natural over time. Can you tell me more about Patricia? What kind of things did she like? Robert smiled, memories of Patricia's warmth washing over him. She loved reading stories to children at the library, and she could bake the most amazing chocolate chip cookies. He chuckled softly, though she always burned the bottom of every batch. Amara giggled. Maybe we could try making cookies sometime? I promise I'll help watch so they don't burn. I'd like that very much, Robert replied, feeling the weight of guilt and uncertainty beginning to lift from his shoulders. Looking at Amara now, he saw not just the mysteries of the past, but the promise of their future together. The autumn wind rustled through the trees as Robert pulled up to Ethan Harper's modest home on the outskirts of town. His hands trembled slightly as he turned off the engine, knowing this conversation might finally reveal the last pieces of the puzzle that had consumed his thoughts. Ethan was waiting on his front porch, a steaming cup of coffee in his weathered hands. His silver hair caught the morning light as he waved Robert over. I had a feeling you might come back, he said, gesturing to an empty chair beside him. Robert settled into the wooden seat, his heart pounding. I need to know everything about that night, Ethan. Every detail you can remember. The retired paramedic nodded slowly, his eyes distant with memory. I've been thinking about it since your last visit. There's something I didn't tell you. He set his coffee down, leaning forward. Just before we arrived on scene, I saw your wife, Patricia. She was reaching through the broken window of the other car. Robert's breath caught in his throat. What was she doing? She was talking to the pregnant woman inside, trying to keep her calm. I remember seeing Patricia take off her necklace, a silver locket, and pass it through the window. Ethan's voice grew softer. She told the woman to hold on to it, that help was coming. Tears welled in Robert's eyes as he pictured Patricia's final moments of selfless courage. Did you hear anything they said to each other? Ethan nodded, his expression gentle. The pregnant woman was fading in and out of consciousness, but she kept whispering one word over and over. Amara. It was her daughter's name. He paused, placing a steady hand on Robert's shoulder. Your wife's actions gave us the precious minutes we needed. The mother. She didn't make it, but because of Patricia's sacrifice, we were able to save the baby, your Amara. Robert covered his face with his hands, overwhelmed by the weight of this revelation. All this time, Patricia's final act had been to save the child who would eventually become his daughter. The coincidence seemed too profound to be mere chance. Patricia refused to leave that woman's side, Ethan continued softly. She kept talking to her, holding her hand through the window, even when the situation became critical. She could have saved herself, but... His voice trailed off. But she chose to stay, Robert finished, his voice thick with emotion. That was Patricia, always putting others first. Ethan nodded. I've seen a lot of tragedy in my years as a paramedic, but I've also witnessed incredible acts of courage. What your wife did that night, giving that mother comfort in her final moments, helping us save that baby, it was one of the most selfless things I've ever seen. Robert sat in silence for a long moment, letting the truth wash over him. The guilt that had been weighing on his heart began to lift, replaced by a profound sense of peace. Patricia hadn't just died in a senseless accident. She had died ensuring that a precious life would continue. And now, through some miraculous twist of fate, that same life had found its way back to him. Thank you, Robert said finally, his voice steady despite his tears. Thank you for telling me this. Ethan squeezed his shoulder. Patricia's love and courage live on in that little girl. I hope knowing that brings you some peace. Robert nodded, feeling lighter than he had in years. The mystery of the locket, Amara's connection to Patricia, the accident, it all made perfect sense now. His wife's final act of love had created a bridge between past and present, between loss and hope, between death and new life. Back at home, Robert spread Patricia's journal, photographs, and newspaper clippings across his desk. Each piece told part of the remarkable story that connected his past to his present. The evening light filtered through his study window as he carefully arranged everything in a way that would make sense to a 7-year-old. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up the photograph from the safe house, the one showing Patricia with Amara's mother. Their smiles captured a moment of hope and friendship that had seemed lost forever. Until now. The doorbell rang, startling him from his thoughts. Alan Green stood on the porch, holding a paper bag of takeout food. "Thought you might need some dinner," he said, stepping inside. "And maybe someone to talk to." Robert managed a weak smile. "You always know when to show up, don't you?" They settled in the kitchen, the familiar aroma of Chinese food filling the air. Alan watched as Robert pushed rice around his plate, barely eating. "Something's on your mind," Alan observed quietly. "I'm going to tell her everything," Robert said, setting down his fork. "About Patricia, the accident, how it's all connected." He glanced toward the stairs where Amara was in her room doing homework. I'm scared, Alan. What if it's too much for her? What if she doesn't understand?" Alan leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Robert, that little girl has been through more in her 7 years than most adults can handle. And you know what? She's still the most resilient, loving child I've ever met." "But this isn't just any story," Robert protested. "This is about her mother, about Patricia's sacrifice. It's about life and death and love," Alan finished firmly. "At its core, this is a story about love. Patricia's love for a stranger who needed help. Your love for Patricia. And now, your love for Amara." Robert's eyes grew misty. "I just don't want to hurt her." "Sometimes the truth hurts," Alan said gently. "But lies and secrets hurt more in the long run. Amara deserves to know where she came from, how Patricia's courage saved her life. It might even help her understand why she ended up here, with you." Later that night, after Alan had gone home, Robert stood outside Amara's bedroom. The light under her door cast a warm glow in the hallway. He could hear her humming softly to herself as she got ready for bed. His hand raised to knock, then lowered again. The weight of everything he needed to say pressed heavily on his heart. Through the door, he heard Amara's bed creak as she climbed in, followed by the soft click of her bedside lamp. "Tomorrow," he whispered to himself, touching the doorframe gently. "Tomorrow, I'll tell you everything, sweetheart." As he walked back to his study, Robert felt both terrified and relieved. The truth that had seemed so overwhelming when he first discovered it now felt like a gift waiting to be shared. Tomorrow would change everything, but perhaps that's exactly what both he and Amara needed. The autumn morning wrapped the park in a gentle embrace of golden sunlight. Robert and Amara walked hand in hand along the winding path until they reached their favorite bench near the duck pond. The familiar spot had become their special place for weekend talks and sharing ice cream cones, but today felt different. Robert's backpack held Patricia's journal, the photographs and newspaper clippings, pieces of a story that would change both their lives forever. He watched as Amara tossed bits of bread to the eager ducks, her silver locket catching the morning light. "Amara, sweetheart," Robert said softly, patting the space next to him on the bench. "There's something important I need to share with you." Amara settled beside him, her small hands folded in her lap. She looked up at him with those bright, curious eyes that reminded him so much of Patricia's compassionate gaze. "Remember how we wondered about your necklace?" Robert began, carefully removing Patricia's journal from his backpack. The worn leather cover felt warm in his hands. "Well, I've discovered something amazing about it, and about 2 very brave women." He opened the journal to where Patricia had written about the young mother she'd helped at the hospital. As he read Patricia's words aloud, Amara leaned closer, her fingers unconsciously reaching for her locket. "This is Patricia," Robert said, showing her the photograph from the safe house. "And this woman next to her, that's your mother." Amara's eyes widened as she stared at the image. Her mother's smile was just like her own, bright and full of hope. "They knew each other?" she whispered. Robert nodded, his voice gentle. "Patricia helped your mother when she needed someone most. They became friends." He pulled out another photograph, this one showing the house with the red door. "Remember the house you drew when we first met? This is where Patricia helped your mother find safety." Tears welled in Amara's eyes as she traced her mother's face in the photograph. Robert wrapped an arm around her shoulders, giving her time to process. "There's more to the story," he continued carefully. "The day of the accident, Patricia was trying to save your mother. She gave her this locket, the one you're wearing now, to help keep her calm until help arrived." Amara's hand clutched the locket tightly. "Is that why?" She couldn't finish the question, but Robert understood. "Yes, sweetheart. Patricia's bravery gave the paramedics enough time to save you. Your mother held onto that locket until the very end, making sure you would have something to remember her by." Tears rolled down Amara's cheeks as she opened the locket, looking at Patricia's photograph inside with new understanding. "They both tried to save each other?" she asked quietly. Robert felt his own eyes growing misty. "Yes, they did. And in a way, they both succeeded. Your mother gave Patricia the chance to help someone in need, something she always wanted to do. And Patricia," his voice caught for a moment, "Patricia helped make sure you would have a chance at life." Amara sat quietly for a long moment, processing everything she'd heard. The ducks continued their peaceful paddling in the pond, oblivious to the weight of the moment. Finally, she looked up at Robert, her eyes full of wonder and understanding beyond her years. "Does this mean my mother and Patricia saved each other?" The following Monday at school, Amara sat quietly at her desk, her mind still swimming with everything Robert had told her about Patricia and her mother. The silver locket felt heavier now, carrying the weight of their shared sacrifice. During recess, she found Lily sitting in their usual spot under the big oak tree. Her friend was drawing butterflies in her notebook, but looked up when Amara approached. "You seem different today," Lily said softly, scooting over to make room. Amara touched her locket, the metal warm against her fingers. "Robert told me about my mom yesterday, and about Patricia, his wife who died." Her voice trembled slightly. "They knew each other. They tried to save each other." Lily put down her pencil and listened intently as Amara shared the story. Her eyes grew wide when Amara explained about the accident and how Patricia had given her mother the locket. "That's why this means so much to me now," Amara said, opening the locket to show Lily the photograph inside. "It's like having both of them with me." Lily reached out and squeezed Amara's hand. "I bet they'd be really proud of you," she said simply. "You're always helping people just like they did. Remember when you stood up for me when those kids were being mean?" Amara felt warmth spread through her chest at Lily's words. She hadn't thought about it that way before. Meanwhile, at the library, Robert was struggling to focus on his work. He kept wondering if he'd overwhelmed Amara with too much information too soon. The memory of her tears in the park haunted him. "You're reorganizing those same books for the third time." Alan's voice broke through his thoughts. His friend leaned against the shelf, watching him with knowing eyes. Robert sighed, setting down the stack of books. "I told Amara everything yesterday. About Patricia, her mother, the accident, all of it." He ran a hand through his hair. "Maybe I should have waited. She's only 7. Alan pulled up a chair and sat down. 7-year-olds understand more than we give them credit for, he said. Besides, honesty builds trust. That's what you want with her, isn't it? Of course it is, Robert replied. But seeing her process all that pain shows that she's strong, Alan finished, just like Patricia would have known she'd be. That evening, Robert was preparing dinner when he heard Amara's footsteps behind him. He turned to find her standing in the kitchen doorway, still wearing her school uniform. "Can I help?" she asked quietly. "Of course," Robert smiled, pulling out a chair so she could reach the counter. They worked together in comfortable silence for a while, Amara carefully tearing lettuce leaves for the salad. "Thank you for telling me about my mom and Patricia," she said suddenly, her small hands pausing their work. Lily said they'd be proud of me. Do you think that's true? Robert's heart swelled with emotion. I know it's true, sweetheart. Amara slid off her chair and wrapped her arms around Robert's waist in a tight hug. I'm glad you're my dad now, she whispered against his shirt. Robert held her close, feeling the weight of doubt lift from his shoulders. The truth hadn't broken their bond. It had made it stronger. Robert stood in the small jewelry shop downtown, carefully examining the delicate silver charm in his palm. The morning sunlight streaming through the window made the fresh engraving sparkle. Family is forever. He thought about how much had changed since Amara came into his life, how their shared connection to Patricia had brought them closer together. It's perfect, he told the jeweler, an elderly man who had helped him pick out the right size and style. Amara's going to love it. On the drive home, Robert's heart felt lighter than it had in years. The small velvet box sat safely in his jacket pocket, and he couldn't help but smile thinking about Amara's reaction. He found her in the living room, sprawled on the carpet with her colored pencils, working on another drawing. The silver locket hung faithfully around her neck, catching the afternoon light. Amara, he said softly, sitting down cross-legged beside her. I have something special for you. She looked up from her artwork, curiosity brightening her eyes. What is it? Robert pulled out the velvet box and held it out to her. It's something to add to your locket, something to remind you that you'll always have a family now. Amara's small hands trembled slightly as she opened the box. Her eyes widened when she saw the charm, and she carefully lifted it up to read the words. Family is forever, she whispered, running her finger over the engraving. Tears welled up in her eyes, but these were different from the sad tears she'd shed before. These sparkled with joy. Can you help me put it on? She asked, already reaching for her locket. Robert's fingers worked carefully to attach the charm alongside the locket. When it was secure, Amara held it up, watching both pieces shine together. I was thinking, Robert said, maybe we could make a special place here at home. A corner where we can put pictures of everyone who makes our family special. Patricia, your mother, you and me. Amara's face lit up. Like a memory corner. Exactly like that, we could put it right here. He gestured to the empty corner near the fireplace. We could frame some photos, maybe display some of your artwork too. Amara jumped up, excitement radiating from her. Can we do it now? I have the perfect drawing to put there. Together, they spent the afternoon creating their memory corner. Robert brought down the box of Patricia's photos from the attic, and they chose their favorites. There was one of Patricia volunteering at the safe house, her warm smile radiating kindness. Another showed her in front of the library, books tucked under her arm. They found a beautiful frame for the photograph of Amara's mother from the safe house, placing it centrally in their display. Amara carefully arranged her drawings around the photos. Pictures of houses with red doors, of families holding hands, of butterflies taking flight. As they worked, Amara kept touching her locket and the new charm, as if reassuring herself they were still there. Her movements were gentle, reverent, like she was handling something precious beyond measure. It's beautiful, she breathed when they finally stepped back to admire their work. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow over their creation, making the frames gleam and the colors in Amara's artwork seem even brighter. Robert watched as Amara stood before their memory corner, her hand clasped around her locket and charm. In that moment, she looked truly at peace, finally secure in the knowledge that she belonged. The Saturday morning dawned bright and clear as Robert packed a wicker basket with sandwiches, fruit, and Patricia's favorite chocolate chip cookies from the local bakery. He smiled, remembering how she used to insist that picnics weren't complete without something sweet. Can I help? Amara asked, bouncing on her toes near the kitchen counter. She wore a yellow sundress and had tied her hair back with a ribbon that matched her necklace. Of course, why don't you wrap these cookies in napkins? Robert handed her the treats, watching as she carefully folded each napkin into neat triangles, just like he'd shown her. They drove to Patterson Park, where Patricia had spent countless afternoons reading under the giant oak trees. Robert carried the basket while Amara skipped ahead, clutching their checkered blanket to her chest. "Is this where you and Patricia used to sit?" Amara pointed to a spot beneath a sprawling oak tree, its branches creating a perfect canopy of shade. "That's exactly right," Robert said, his heart warming at how she remembered the stories he'd shared. She loved this tree, said it was like having a roof made of leaves. They spread the blanket and arranged their picnic feast. Amara sat cross-legged, carefully holding her sandwich over her napkin just like Robert did. These little moments of mirroring touched him deeply. Nearby, a family with 3 young children played frisbee, their laughter carrying across the grass. Amara watched them, absently touching her locket and charm. "They look so happy," she said softly. Then, turning to Robert with bright eyes, she added, "Just like us now." Robert felt his throat tighten with emotion. "We are happy, aren't we?" Amara nodded enthusiastically. "The happiest. And look." She pointed to her perfectly arranged napkin and sandwich. "I'm doing it just like you taught me, like a real family." "We are a real family, sweetheart," Robert said, reaching out to squeeze her hand. "Different from some, but just as real." They spent the afternoon cloud watching, something Patricia had loved to do. Amara proved to have quite an imagination, seeing dragons and castles where Robert only saw fluffy shapes. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, Amara sat up suddenly. "Could we go to that special bakery you told me about? The one where Patricia liked to get cinnamon rolls?" "Madeline's Bakery?" Robert asked, touched that she remembered this detail too. "Yes. You said she always got 2 cinnamon rolls, one for breakfast and one for later, but she always ate them both for breakfast anyway." Amara giggled at the memory of the story. "That's exactly right," Robert laughed, beginning to pack up their picnic supplies. She could never resist them when they were fresh and warm. As they folded the blanket together, each taking 2 corners and meeting in the middle, Amara's face grew thoughtful. "Maybe we could get cinnamon rolls sometimes too. Not every day, but like Patricia did. For special times." Robert felt his heart swell with love for this little girl who so carefully wove Patricia's memory into their present life. "I think that's a wonderful idea. Should we start today?" Amara's face lit up with joy and she hugged the folded blanket to her chest. "Yes, please. And can we eat them both for breakfast tomorrow?" "Just like Patricia?" Robert asked, knowing the answer. "Just like Patricia," Amara confirmed with a grin that could have lit up the darkening sky. The library's community hall buzzed with excitement as decorations sparkled from every corner. Streamers in soft blues and greens hung from the ceiling, and tables laden with punch and cookies lined the walls. Robert stood near the podium, adjusting his tie nervously, while Amara beamed beside him in her favorite purple dress, her silver locket gleaming against the fabric. "Look at all the people who came," Amara whispered, squeezing Robert's hand. The room was indeed packed with familiar faces, regular library patrons, teachers from Amara's school, and what seemed like half the town. Mrs. Chen, a longtime library volunteer, approached them with a warm smile. Before Robert could speak, Amara stepped forward confidently. "Hi, I'm Amara Sinclair, Robert's daughter," she announced proudly, extending her small hand just as Robert had taught her. Mrs. Chen's eyes sparkled as she shook it, glancing at Robert with approval. "What a lovely introduction," Mrs. Chen said. "Your father has done so much for our library." Robert felt his chest tighten at the word father. Each time Amara claimed him as her own, it filled his heart with joy he couldn't quite contain. The library board president called everyone to attention, beginning a speech about Robert's 15 years of service. As she listed his accomplishments, the children's reading program, the senior computer classes, the weekend story times, Amara stood straighter and straighter, practically bursting with pride. "And now," the president announced, "Robert's daughter Amara has something she'd like to share." Robert blinked in surprise. This wasn't part of the program he'd seen. Amara slipped away from his side and walked to the podium, pulling something from behind her back. It was a large handmade card, decorated with glitter and carefully drawn books. "I made this for my dad," she began, her voice clear and strong. "When I first met him at the adoption fair, I was drawing a house with a red door. I didn't know then that I was drawing my future home." She paused, opening the card. Inside, I wrote, "Thank you for being my dad. Thank you for sharing Patricia's stories with me. Thank you for making me feel like I belong. I love you." Tears welled in Robert's eyes as Amara walked back to him, holding out the card. He knelt down to her level, taking the card with trembling hands. The room had gone quiet, but he barely noticed, focused entirely on the careful handwriting and the little hearts she'd drawn around the words. "Oh, sweetheart," he whispered, pulling her into a tight hug. She wrapped her arms around his neck, and he could feel her smile against his shoulder. The room erupted in applause, but for Robert and Amara, it was as if they were in their own little world. When they finally pulled apart, both wiping happy tears from their eyes, the community gathered around them with congratulations and well wishes. As the evening wound down, Robert and Amara walked hand in hand toward home. The setting sun painted the sky in beautiful pinks and oranges, and a gentle breeze rustled the trees lining their street. "Did you really mean everything you wrote in the card?" Robert asked softly. Amara squeezed his hand. "Every single word. You're the best dad ever." Robert squeezed back, his heart full to bursting. Together, they walked toward their house with the red door, their footsteps in perfect sync, both knowing they'd found exactly where they belonged. The attic was filled with dancing dust motes in the afternoon sunlight, as Robert and Amara sorted through boxes of Patricia's belongings. They had decided to create a proper memory album, carefully selecting special items that told the story of their unique family. "What's in this one?" Amara asked, pointing to a worn cardboard box labeled "Personal Papers." Robert lifted the box down from its shelf. "These are some of Patricia's letters and documents. We should find some nice photos in here." As they began sorting through the contents, Amara's small hands carefully lifted each item with reverence. She had come to feel a deep connection to Patricia, even though they had never met. Suddenly, her fingers brushed against a sealed envelope at the bottom of the box. "Dad, look!" she exclaimed, holding up the envelope. "It says, 'For Robert' on it." Robert's breath caught in his throat as he recognized Patricia's elegant handwriting. The envelope was slightly yellowed with age but had never been opened. His hands trembled slightly as he took it from Amara. "Should we read it together?" Amara asked softly, sensing the importance of the moment. Robert nodded, unable to speak. He carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. Amara snuggled close to him as he began to read aloud. "My dearest Robert, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer with you. I've been thinking a lot about our dreams of fostering a child, and I wanted to share my thoughts with you, even if I'm not there to see them come true. I know you might be scared to open your heart again. You have so much love to give, Robert, and somewhere out there is a child who needs exactly what you can offer: stability, kindness, and unconditional love. No matter who this child is or where they come from, love will make us a family. I believe that with all my heart. When the time comes and you meet this special child, please remember that families aren't just made by blood. They're made by choice, by love, and by the daily decision to be there for each other. I want you to know that my greatest wish is for you to find happiness again, to share your wonderful heart with a child who needs a home. Don't let fear hold you back. You have always been the strongest person I know, even if you don't see it yourself. Remember, darling, that love has a way of coming full circle. The love we shared will never die. It will only grow and transform, making room for new joy and new beginnings. With all my love, Patricia." Robert's voice cracked on the last words. Amara wrapped her arms around him, tears streaming down her face. They sat in silence for a moment, both processing the powerful message Patricia had left behind. "It's like she knew," Amara whispered, touching her locket. "She knew we would find each other." Robert pulled Amara closer, kissing the top of her head. "Patricia always did have a way of seeing things clearly," he said softly. "She understood that love makes a family, just like she wrote, and she was right about everything." Amara carefully took the letter and read it again to herself, her fingers tracing Patricia's words. "Can we put this in our memory album, right next to the picture of you and Patricia?" "I think that's perfect," Robert replied, his heart full of gratitude for the two remarkable women who had shaped his life, the wife who had shown him how to love, and the daughter who had taught him how to love again. The art room buzzed with excitement as students prepared their pieces for the upcoming show. Amara sat at her desk, colored pencils spread before her, working intently on her drawing. Her small fingers moved with purpose across the paper, adding careful details to the silver locket at the center of her piece. Mrs. Dawson walked between the desks, stopping to observe Amara's work. "That's beautiful, Amara. Would you like to tell me about it?" Amara looked up, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "It's about my necklace," she explained, touching the locket that hung around her neck. "But it's also about how love gets passed down, like a special gift." In her drawing, warm colors surrounded two figures, a woman with gentle eyes bending down to give a locket to a young girl. The background showed a mix of scenes: a hospital, a house with a red door, and a library, all connected by flowing ribbons of golden light. At home that evening, Robert helped Amara choose the perfect frame for her artwork. "The gold frame makes the colors pop," he said, carefully positioning the drawing inside. "Do you think people will understand what it means?" Amara asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Robert knelt beside her. "Your drawing tells a beautiful story, sweetheart, and you'll be there to explain it to anyone who wants to know more." The night of the art show transformed the school gymnasium into a gallery. Colorful artwork lined the walls, and proud parents walked with their children from piece to piece. Lily stood next to her own painting, waving excitedly when she spotted Amara and Robert entering. Amara's drawing hung in a prime spot near the center of the display. She stood beside it, wearing her best dress and the locket that had inspired her artwork. Robert watched from nearby as various families stopped to admire her piece. "Can you tell us about your drawing?" a curious parent asked. Amara straightened her shoulders, her voice clear and confident. "It's about how love can connect people, even when they've never met. See this locket?" She touched her necklace. "It belonged to my dad's wife, Patricia. She gave it to my birth mother, who gave it to me. Now when I wear it, I can feel the love from both of them." Robert's chest swelled with pride as he watched Amara explain her artwork to the growing crowd. Mrs. Dawson appeared beside him, smiling warmly. "She's come so far," Mrs. Dawson said softly. "When she first started in my class, she barely spoke above a whisper. Now, look at her." Lily joined Amara, the two girls giggling as they discussed their artwork. Other students gathered around, asking questions about the story behind the locket. Amara answered each one with patience and enthusiasm, her eyes sparkling with joy. As Robert watched his daughter shine, he felt overwhelmed by love and gratitude. The scared little girl from the adoption fair had blossomed into a confident young artist, sharing her story with others. Through her artwork, she had found a way to honor both her past and her present, weaving together the threads of loss and love that had brought them together. The locket caught the light as Amara turned, creating a golden glow that seemed to mirror the warmth in her drawing. She looked over at Robert and beamed, her smile full of pride and belonging. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows of Robert's home as guests began to arrive. The living room buzzed with warm conversation and laughter. Alan Green was the first to arrive, bringing a homemade apple pie that filled the house with its sweet aroma. Lily bounded in with her parents shortly after, rushing to give Amara a tight hug. The two girls immediately began chattering about their art show success, while their families got acquainted. Robert had arranged a simple spread of snacks and drinks on the dining room table, but what caught everyone's attention was the beautifully arranged memory corner. Photos of Patricia smiled down at the gathering, alongside pictures of Amara's mother and new snapshots of Robert and Amara's growing life together. "Everyone," Robert called out, gently placing his hand on Amara's shoulder. "I wanted to gather you all here today because you've been such an important part of our journey." His voice wavered slightly with emotion. "I'd like to formally introduce you to my daughter, Amara." Amara beamed up at him, her eyes shining. Alan Green raised his glass in a toast, and several guests wiped away tears. "I have something for you, Dad," Amara said, emphasizing the word "dad" with obvious joy. She disappeared into her room and returned carrying a wrapped package. Robert carefully unwrapped it to reveal a framed photograph of himself and Amara, standing by their memory corner. In the photo, they were both laughing, caught in a natural moment of happiness. The silver frame bore an engraving, "Where love makes a family." "Oh, sweetheart," Robert whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He pulled Amara into a tight hug as their friends watched with misty eyes. Alan Green cleared his throat. "You two," he said warmly, "are exactly what Patricia would have wanted. A real family." Lily squeezed her friend's hand and Amara touched the locket at her neck, now bearing both the original photograph and the new charm Robert had given her. As their friends gathered around to admire the photo, Robert and Amara shared a quiet look of understanding. Their journey had brought them more than just each other. It had given them a whole community of love and support. The new photograph took its place of honor in the memory corner, a testament to their present happiness alongside the treasured memories of the past. The following Saturday morning, Amara fidgeted with her locket as she sat at the breakfast table. "Dad," she said softly, "could we visit the safe house? The one where Patricia helped my mom?" Robert looked up from his coffee, surprised but touched by the request. "Of course we can, sweetheart. Are you sure you're ready?" Amara nodded, carefully picking up her artwork from the school show that she had wrapped in brown paper. "I want to give them this," she explained. When they arrived at the safe house, Diane Walker greeted them with a warm smile. The building looked brighter than Robert remembered, with fresh paint and cheerful flowers dotting the entrance. "We've made some changes," Diane said, leading them inside. "New furniture in the common room, and we've added a children's play area." She gestured to a colorful corner filled with toys and books. Amara's eyes lit up as she took in the surroundings. Young mothers sat with their children, reading stories or playing games. The walls were decorated with inspiring quotes and artwork. "I brought something," Amara said, carefully unwrapping her drawing. "It's about my locket and how love gets passed down." She held up the artwork, showing Diane the detailed illustration of a woman passing a locket to a young girl. Diane's eyes welled with tears as she studied the picture. "This is beautiful, Amara. Would you like to tell me more about it?" As Amara explained the symbolism in her drawing, Robert watched with pride. His daughter spoke with confidence and compassion, her words touching everyone within earshot. "I thought maybe it could help other people feel hopeful," Amara explained. "Like how Patricia helped my mom, and now the locket helps me." Diane found the perfect spot for the artwork, right in the entrance hallway where everyone could see it. "Your drawing will remind our residents that they're not alone," she said, carefully hanging the piece. "That's exactly what Patricia always wanted them to know." Robert felt a familiar tightness in his chest as he watched Amara beam with pride. In that moment, he saw so much of Patricia in her, the same desire to help others, the same gentle spirit that had first drawn him to his late wife. "Patricia would be so proud of you," he whispered to Amara, who squeezed his hand in response. A young mother approached them, her baby sleeping peacefully in her arms. "Your drawing," she said to Amara. "It gives me hope. Thank you." Amara touched her locket, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "That's what Patricia would have wanted," she replied with a smile that lit up the room. The morning air was crisp as Robert and Amara made their way through the cemetery's winding paths. Amara clutched a bouquet of white lilies, Patricia's favorites, while Robert carried a framed photograph of their memory corner at home. At Patricia's gravestone, they carefully arranged the flowers and placed the photograph against the smooth marble. Amara's hand instinctively went to her locket, drawing strength from its familiar presence. "Can I read my letter now?" Amara asked softly, pulling out a carefully folded piece of paper from her pocket. Robert nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He watched as Amara unfolded the paper, her small hands trembling slightly. "Dear Patricia," Amara began, her voice clear and steady. "I never got to meet you, but I feel like I know you through the stories Robert tells me and through this special locket that connected us all together. Thank you for helping my mom when she needed someone and for saving both of us that day." Robert blinked back tears as Amara continued reading. "Sometimes when I look in the mirror wearing this locket, I imagine you're watching over me. Robert says you always wanted to help children find their forever homes, and because of you, I found mine. I promise to be kind like you were, to help others when they need it, and to make you proud." Amara's voice wavered slightly as she reached the end of her letter. "I want you to know that Robert is the best dad anyone could ask for. He tells me that's because you taught him how to love so big. Thank you for bringing him into my life. Love, Amara." Robert knelt beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. Together they placed the letter near the flowers. Amara then carefully removed the "Family is Forever" charm from her locket and nestled it among the lilies. "Are you sure you want to leave it?" Robert asked gently. Amara nodded. "It belongs here too, it's part of our story." They stood together in comfortable silence, the morning sun warming their faces. The breeze rustled the flowers, making the charm glint in the light. Robert thought about how far they'd come, from two broken hearts to a family bound together by Patricia's legacy of love. "Ready to go home?" Robert asked after a while, holding out his hand. "Yes," Amara replied, slipping her small hand into his. As they walked away, she looked back one last time at the grave. "Goodbye, Patricia. Thank you for everything." The autumn sun painted golden streaks across the community center's parking lot as Robert and Amara set up their volunteer booth at the adoption fair. It was the same place where, just over a year ago, their story had begun with a shy girl drawing pictures and a hesitant man seeking connection. Now colorful balloons bobbed in the breeze as families milled about. Amara arranged her artwork on their table, drawings that told their story of finding each other, the mysterious locket, and the love that had brought them together. "Look, Dad," Amara said, pointing to a young boy sitting alone in the corner. "He reminds me of how I felt last year." Robert squeezed her shoulder gently. "Why don't you go talk to him?" Amara approached the boy carefully, noticing his downcast eyes and fidgeting hands. "Hi, I'm Amara. Would you like to draw with me?" She pulled out her trusted box of crayons, the same ones she'd had at last year's fair. The boy looked up cautiously. "I'm Marcus," he whispered. As they colored together, Amara shared her story. "See this necklace?" She touched her locket. "It helped me find my dad. Well, he wasn't my dad then, but he is now. Sometimes families find each other in surprising ways." Marcus listened intently as Amara explained how she and Robert had grown from strangers into family. "But what if nobody wants me?" he asked quietly. "That's what I thought too," Amara replied, her voice gentle but firm. "But love doesn't care where you come from. It just needs a chance to grow." Robert watched from the booth as his daughter's words brought a small smile to Marcus's face. He marveled at how much she'd grown, from a quiet, uncertain child to this confident young girl who freely shared her heart with others. Families stopped by their booth throughout the day, drawn in by Amara's artwork and her infectious smile. She told their story again and again, her voice growing stronger with each telling. The locket around her neck caught the light as she gestured, a reminder of the extraordinary chain of events that had brought them together. As the afternoon wound down, Robert and Amara walked through the fairgrounds together, their footsteps light on the fallen leaves. Amara's laughter rang out as she tried to catch a balloon that had broken free from its string. "Dad," she said, her eyes bright with joy, "I'm so glad we found each other." Robert pulled her close, remembering his own fears and doubts from a year ago. "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." If you enjoyed the story of Robert and Amara, I hand-picked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.